Let me try again. Okay, talking about Mardi Gras Indians, in general New Orleans music, actually this after Jazz and Heritage Festival, did you make any kind of additional effort to promote these albums on the theory that thousands of people were going to go off to the four corners of the country, or did you simply try and sell them in New Orleans to people who were down there?
No. We definitely did have, and that was part of the reason, of course, that it was in the interest of trying to get the broadest attention possible and sales possible for all of these records that we created the Modern New Orleans Masters series. So in fact, usually you were able, either leading up to Jazz Festival or coming right off Jazz Festival or right before Mardi Gras or right after Mardi Gras, we were able to coordinate without spending tons of money. We've always been very conservative financially about marketing. I mean, there's no question about that. Although it sometimes has meant, spending, I think one year that we may have done a promotion, various promotions that altogether were like $28,000 nationwide. $28,000 is setting up programs at Tower. We actually, a couple of years running, had some display contests at some of the indie retailers that we could always count on to be behind this entire series, and who were...
You're talking specifically about New Orleans stuff?
Yeah, New Orleans, Modern New Orleans Master Series, and don't forget, at that time, I think we not only were Johnny and Irma included in that series, yes, and Mardi Gras Indians, and the brass bands.
You want to look.
But Professor Longhair was there.
Take that
I can't remember whether... Oh, yeah, and in fact...
That's numerical.
Eventually, we did the Collector's Choice from having bought, not Collector's Choice, that particular title, but doing the Rick and Ron reissues got us some other things like, and then the best, the Carnival Time record, which obviously was New Orleans R&B from an earlier period. Then Scott did his Tony DeGradi, which would have been a more modern New Orleans master.
You've got the new New Orleans Masters as well. Was that a different, or that's some anthology records? Or
those are some anthology records. And the other thing in that series, and David Torkanowski was another one that Scott really wanted to do. But we also do have the Zydeco in the 2000 series, and still do. That won't be coming out on Bullseye. So of course, each time we did a promotion for New Orleans, it wasn't just New Orleans, it also included other black music from other parts of Louisiana, like the Zydeco music, so that was there too. And then we did a brass bands compilation that we licensed some of the titles. The late Red Tyler, a wonderful jazz saxophone player, Earl Turbinton, I mentioned, the Coltrane of New Orleans, that was one that Ron did. The Red Tyler was one of the first ones that Scott did. And Red is a wonderful, underappreciated New Orleans saxophone player. And of course we did an Ellis Marsalis piano record that I forget, Scott got the tapes maybe from a guy who used to work at the Jazz and Heritage Festival there, and the Delafosse records, Jermaine Basil. So there were lots and lots of people. We did those promotions very broadly, so that in fact some of the reissues would be included. Like, actually, Professor Longhair wasn't a reissue, but it was previously unissued.
Right.
So it was older music. So we would definitely promote that as part of it. And eventually, as you can see from looking at this, there literally were a dozen of titles, and what we would try and do is get the new releases to be put on sale at any of the stores that we could get to participate in this, and then a lot of them would buy in a little bit better on catalog, at least say the top 25 or the top 50 titles, and in the case of Tower, sometimes more than that, because the whole Tower chain was very good. And there was a time in the late 80s, early 90s that Tower New Orleans was the guy who was the manager was absolutely incredible. In fact, he's now at one of the more prominent Tower stores elsewhere, which was a great loss. And Tower has never been the same since, although it's not just a personnel issue, it's also that there's now a lot more competition than there was when this guy was there.
What was his name?
You know what? I'm trying to think, and I cannot remember it. Ken would remember. No, Ken probably wouldn't remember, but one of us will remember. One of us will remember because he was also a really big bluegrass fan as well, and he just was a really hard-working guy. And in fact, he was the one who set up the initial in-store appearances that we would do during Jazz Fest, literally every day of the week. At the store, we'd have brass bands, or Marcia Ball, or Thomas and Johnny Adams, or even had the Indians one year.
You're talking now mid to late 80s?
The late 80s, early 90s.
Right, okay.
Yep. Freddie, and it was a more ethnic sounding last name, but I'll remember it.
All right, well, we'll get that.
Yep.
That's what I want. You were anticipating a question, but you didn't know it. You said no one was doing this. What happened? No one was putting out New Orleans music to the degree you started doing it in the 80s. What happened in the industry, speaking now as a record company president, after that? Did it start spreading around?
No, not a whole lot.
Really?
What has really happened a whole lot since that time, although now we're talking mid to late 90s, really, is there's been a proliferation of sort of boutique labels and imprints, which has provided, unfortunately, a great deal more competition for labels like ourselves or Alligator or anyone who specializes in a particular genre. Obviously, we have many genres that we specialize in, but across the board, there has been really kind of an explosion. And it's definitely pre-internet, so you can't say it has to do with the internet, but it has to do with the fact that the record business overall has become, like the music business overall, has become so fragmented that there are lots of, and we'll see how many of them, wind up lasting even 10 years or even 5 years in some cases. But little boutique imprints that sometimes specialize in reissues. In fact, I'm not positive of this, but I think that some of those older Mardi Gras Indians titles, in fact, may have been reissued. Or in the case, for example, of Roomful of Blues, their earliest titles have just been reissued by another small company whose name I forget, even though the producer is someone whose work I really do respect. I just bought this Ross on Roland Kirk record that Joel Dorn, who's the producer in question, was in charge of this reissue, and he produced all of the original titles that were in this collection. And he's a very good person now. He's connected with some label. So there's an explosion of literally dozens, and it's both good and bad. It's bad in the sense that the record market is already so oversaturated that it just means that there's more competition for one consumer's buy. But at the same time, of course, it's good that there's so much variety out there, that there's so much diversity, and that there are more things that people can get if they know what they're looking for.
I wonder how they last. Chris Drackwood said to me, "You could never start our Hooli today," and you're telling me that
absolutely
all these people are doing it.
Yes. No,
there's some disconnect here.
No, it's absolutely true. But the ones that are doing it, for the most part, are doing things that don't cost very much. If you're willing to basically not support yourself doing it, or to do it on a shoestring for a very long period of time, I think you probably can do it. But on the other hand, Chris is absolutely right in the sense that there's virtually no way to get any kind of distribution. So it's a very tough time. There's no question that we could not have started Rounder today. We could not start Rounder with the number of releases that we put out each year. It simply would have not been possible because we wouldn't be selling enough of any one title to even be able to put out the others. And of course, it's more expensive to put out records today than it was back when we started, let alone when Chris started. And see, I don't know how much you want to get into, for example, things that have to do with motivations and how each person's life story affects what they do. But for example, Chris, you mentioned him. To me, Chris is an absolute inspiration, and he's a very tragic figure.
How so? I do want to get into that a little bit.
I love Chris. I think he's a wonderful guy, and he's always done things his own way. And I have always admired and respected him because he is very conscious about what he's doing, even though it may go against the grain. And I think the fact that the whole business is so much more complex now means that there aren't really room for people like Chris the way that. And I also think that Chris is a very tragic figure in terms of his personal story. I'll never forget how sweet he was to Ron and me when AJ was first born, and Chris had been having some medical issues. Plus, Chris has never married and has no children, and he said, his face, he's just so happy. He's just, it's such a blessing. I have all of this, but what's it going to mean after I'm gone? And I thought it was just very sad because everything he does, he personalizes, frankly, to a much greater degree than the three of us, with possibly the exception of Ken, do. And, he sort of put his whole life into just his company. And as he's gotten older, I think it's quite obvious, that there's a real sadness there. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I also think that there's tragedy in the sense of also someone who knows that even though there's some real sadness there, that they would never have lived their life any differently than they have. And that's the stuff of real tragedy as opposed to pathos.
I do want to. I want to do it with maybe another setting, and I also want to find out when my flight back is. But I do actually want to, with you, I want to go back early on, back more about some of the mechanics at the beginning and your political leanings and what have you. If you don't mind at some point, staying on what we were talking about, are there any cases in which you feel that rather helped jumpstart a performing career?
Oh, many. No question.
So, talking about the Louisiana
and it doesn't mean, of course, that they became, Aretha Franklin. But there's no question. For example, Irma Thomas and Johnny Adams.
I mean, playing when they wouldn't have played.
Yes.
That's what I mean. So why don't you?
Both Irma and Johnny were able to have careers outside of New Orleans when I don't think that they would have if they had. And I'm not saying that no other company could have come along and have done possibly the same thing, but I think it's the way in which we did it differently than someone else would have is we continued to put out records by them even when they were in some cases perhaps selling only marginally. And the fact is that in order for somebody like Johnny Adams or Irma Thomas to have a career, when basically, let's face it, the R&B business when it was at its height was a business that was based on radio play and singles. So of course the record business, basically almost all of New Orleans music was just sort of left to die and decay. There simply was no place. In the case of R&B, it's a particularly glaring example. There was no radio to play that kind of music, and the very medium that created that business, which was singles, was also gone. And yet with Irma and Johnny, they were broad enough artists, musically speaking, that they were able to go on and have, if not a substantial career in terms of hit making, at least a career that brought them acclaim, that brought them recognition, that brought their recognition for their talent, and that allowed them to continue to express that talent on record, and brought them to the attention of international audiences. So, there's no question that, and there's no question that each time we did, whether it was a brass band record or a Mardi Gras Indians record or a Zydeco record, that it would help anyone who was there booking them to book them more broadly than if they hadn't had records.
Staying within the same genre we were talking about, any cases where you worked particularly close with the booking agents in terms of coordinating your activities with their activities? I don't know how much
there are so many. There are so many, actually, that it's hard to know where to begin. And not even necessarily personally, but in terms of the promotion department. Once the records were out, that was how we could sell the most records, and how the artist could take the most advantage of having the record was having the booking agent work closely with people here in terms of letting us know about tours as they were being set up, and then what we would usually do is create a press kit for those artists, and then work with whatever the club or the promoter was to get it around, and then get records into the stores in each area that they would be playing. So that was that. Yes, there had to be a lot of coordination of all of that. I can still remember the Rebirth Brass Band at the time that they had a very big single hit in New Orleans. You could still do that in New Orleans, even though you couldn't in the rest of the country.
That's something that may be a tough sell in the rest of the country also, I
Yeah.
think at times. Yeah.
And yet, it was during a time that MTV was very sort of somewhat faddishly, whatever, enthralled with New Orleans, and being there when the Rebirth Brass Band, played at the MTV offices in New York when they were playing in New York. And so a lot of times we'd have either a publicist, the booking agent, or somebody working for us in-house set up any kind of special things like that we could, whether there was a certain period of time when Billboard would have artists come in and play at the New York office, and we would set up things like that too. And it was kind of remarkable to see it wasn't a clash of cultures, the respect for a culture that was very alien to Manhattan in the late 20th century. So yeah, there were lots and lots of occasions like that were, I think, helpful for the artist, and helpful in terms of at least a few more people in the industry having more awareness of that whole culture and that kind of music, and incidentally to help us sell a few more records.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm mulling over a question that I almost think is kind of too soft or too bullshit.
Oh, I like soft questions.
Oh, well, yeah.
They're my favorite kind. You ask me about facts, and I'll say, "Oh, go check the file."
Well, yeah. There's these dichotomy. Ask somebody about facts. And ask somebody, yeah. What? Not with the Mardi Gras Indians or the Rebirth Brass Band, but with the Johnny Adams and Irma Thomas. What roots, what tradition, what were you pulling up? What were you working with? And it may be very easy to answer, or it may be tougher. You said yourself, these are basically pop artists in a way. I think they were always pop artists. Muddy Waters. I remember reading. It might have been in Bill Rooney's book. He was, lionized as of the folk, and all he wanted to do. And I've seen it. He said it. He just wanted to sell singles.
Yeah.
So what were you? What were you getting at? What connection did that have? Maybe a weird conjunction. What connection did that have to a George Pegram, for example?
Oh, George Pegram would have loved to have sold.
I know. Okay, well, probably less chance of that ever happening than a Johnny Adams, but.
I think it's important to realize, though.
Why did Rounder go there? I guess in a way. Why did Rounder go there in a sense with that New Orleans R&B and piano music?
Well, you have to remember though that with the way people see themselves isn't really where they are in the culture.
Yeah.
And there's no question that by the time we were recording Irma Thomas and Johnny Adams, their type of R&B was an anachronism. I mean, a type of R&B that had fueled whatever early career they had, which in the case of Irma was somewhat substantial. She did have at least a regional single hit when she was being produced by Swamp Dogg.
She was very young, too, wasn't she?
She was very young then. And of course, in New Orleans, she had the big hit when she was about 14 or 15 or 16.
That's probably what I'm thinking of.
You can have my husband, but please don't mess with my man.
Yeah.
But, and probably more, and of course when Johnny Adams had his biggest hits was that falsetto hit that was like a sort of almost a country and R&B crossover, and that was it. I mean, he was kind of a one-hit wonder, except for whatever single hits that he had in New Orleans. So that whole music, basically, by the time that we were recording them, which was in the 1980s, was, let's face it, it was practically decades out of date. And in terms of New Orleans piano music, well, it's an ongoing tradition, and sometimes it may get a little bit closer to influencing the mainstream or being able to have a hit, but not really very close. And I think that in terms of what motivated us, well, a lot of times those places where the music after it's had its peak, in some cases, may be musically more interesting than when it did have its peak. Although it's also true, I don't mind saying, that the three of us were also learning as we went along, too. I mean, in fact, I'm still learning as I go along. There's still, it's unquestionably true that we are expert in certain areas of recording. And bluegrass, there's no question that, we've been pioneers in that area in a lot of respects, and from the time of the first of the J.D. Crowe record that had Ricky Skaggs and Tony Rice and Jerry Douglas on it. But it's also true that there's a lot of catching up. I mean, it's such a vast musical realm, this wide world, not even saying wide world, but focusing on this country. And I think it's safe to say that the areas that, particularly during those years, but that's true even today for particularly the three of us, for Ken, Bill, and me, the areas that interested us most are the ones that aren't mainstream and that aren't where you're chasing, the next radio hit. And it's not because, we're more... See, now Ken, I would think, would probably feel that it does come from a place of purity or whatever. In my opinion, for me, that's not really where it comes from. It comes from a place that is just aesthetically more satisfying. But I will also be the first to admit that there are whole entire gaps in our musical knowledge that we came into contact with the tip of the iceberg when we say we're recording in New Orleans or recording in Memphis. And in fact, for me, a lot of what motivated me to sort of want to keep going back to that well is the fact that there is a whole story that you're just tapping into, and that the story itself is fascinating, and it's not a matter of saying, nah, this is right for us, and this isn't right for us, or yes, this is definitely rounder. Now, Ken has that point of view, and I think Scott does more than I do. I've always been more interested in sort of seeing some of the kind of strange forms that musical culture can take in any particular place. And
so in New Orleans, the story would be simply the community group of people that were in some ways insular and played music in the clubs.
Yep.
I mean, you said the story. I mean, putting words into your mouth. What was the story?
Yes, and also of many very interesting and quirky non-mainstream characters. Yeah, I mean, to me, and I think it sounds a little bit like, and as an American studies person, maybe you can appreciate this if you've had any historiography courses or whatever. The great man theory of history was the big deal in the 19th century, which has been totally debunked, which is as well it should. But in the case of music or art or poetry, there's no question that the personality does play a very large part in shaping the music that you create, and that's always fascinating to me, is how the culture and personality interact to create the particular thing. And it is true that, I think that both Scott and Ken are much more, in fact, people who are the great man theory of probably music than I am, because I am interested in the overall context, but I am interested also in how each person's individual crazy life story shapes their art.
You guys have worked a lot with, I don't know, a lot. I don't know if you've worked a lot. I see this, I picked through this booking file, royalty files, a lot of interaction here and there. Use a lot again. Interaction with heritage groups, state heritage groups, or state Louisiana that popped up specifically. How does that come about? Nick Spitzer was involved with you early on in doing the earliest, I think, Zydeco record.
Well, it is true that that's a culture unto itself. Yeah. All of the folk festival and state heritage groups and national heritage groups and so on. Just the way, for example, NPR stations or PBS stations are a culture unto themselves, and it's let's face it, it's one of the few areas. God bless those people. I wish there were more of those kinds of organizations and societies and councils to to bring something aside from what you hear on the radio
right.
to an area so that people can have some contact with the incredible diversity and pluralism of cultures in this crazy country of ours.
Do you know how you hooked up with Nick Spitzer to put out his Zydeco
I think that, in
records?
fact, we hooked up with Nick Spitzer initially through Ralph Rinsler.
Okay.
I know it was definitely through somebody in D.C., and it seems to me it was through Ralph Rinsler, because I think that, in fact, Nick Spitzer worked with Ralph on some of the Zydeco and maybe Cajun recording from South Louisiana, and then wound up doing his radio program. He's one of the many people who kind of grew up with this the way that we did. Now, Bill Ferris, who's presently the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Bill Ivey, who's presently the head of the National Endowment for the Arts, they're all about the same age that we are, and we knew them. I mean, everybody knows everybody in this little world anyway, and so we were aware of them, and in fact met with them at various times, like Bill Ivey when he was at the Country Music Foundation. And Ferris, in fact, we used to sleep on his floor at Yale when he was working on his doctorate there. And then, in fact, I went down and he used to teach some courses at the when he was the head of the Center for Southern Culture at Ole Miss. I remember being there at a course he was giving in the summertime for grad students in folklore and stuff, where he had a lot of guest lecturers, and we've all. He has a lot of tapes that maybe someday, if there's enough of an audience to support it, he'd like to put out some of his tapes, because in fact he's from Vicksburg, Mississippi. But and all of us who have been involved in this along the way, whether it's us running a record company or Bill at the Center for Southern Culture or whatever, you all just sort of try to let people know about something that, it's a dying art.
There always seems to have been a good comfort level with working with government agencies at times. You've gotten grants from the NEH, I don't know. You worked with Louisiana tourism offices. Have you ever met any resistance from that regard? You've met with a lot of
I mean, people do what they can do, is what we've always found. We haven't met with any great resistance, but on the other hand, I think that in almost all of those cases, I mean, aside from the grant, and I think that was when, who was the head of the humanities at that point? Gosh darn if I know. I think Bess Lomax Hawes was the head of arts at that time, and I don't remember who was the head of humanities.
You're talking about the grant to do the bluegrass?
Yeah. And aside from that, we've mostly worked with them in the context of we all have a common cause, which is let's try and promote this artist and this record. And in the case of the councils or the agencies or whatever, they're usually bringing an artist in there, even if it's a free concert. They're trying to get people out for it. So obviously, it's something that, as I say, it's more a common cause, because we're trying to sell some records by these people, and they're trying to put on a concert or a festival or whatever.
Did you get to know any of the Zydeco performers?
Not as many as I would have liked.
Came a little later in your history, much later, when you really started.
Well, Boozoo to me is the great one. You talk to Scott, it would probably be Beaujacques, but Beaujacques, in fact, was kind of a turn-off to me, and it's partly because of being female. I do think he's just like, what can I say? Hopeless. But whereas there are some of the older guys, like Boozoo is one of those characters who's, he doesn't care. He'll sit down and talk through his hat to anyone, whether you're male, female, old, young, or whatever. Whereas with Beaujacques, the Zydeco scene was much more competitive by the time he was coming up, and he's the young Turk, and there's this whole macho thing going on there that was just kind of, you know.
Now, he was 45 when he died, am I not that right? Was that age?
Yes.
He just died a month ago.
Yes.
Always makes me clutch my chest.
That's it. Beware of the South Louisiana diet is one of the lessons therein, as well as don't be a macho competitive.
Well, that's an interesting.
Over-competitive.
Were there differences between the two in terms of a sense of belonging to a culture, a musical culture, an affinity group? Was Bojack more? And these are my words. So I don't know, was Bojack more of a fellow who, this is my form, but I'm going to be a star, whereas Bouzou was more of a
I think that
exemplar of a group of people that played music.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And at the same time, Bojack wasn't willing to do necessarily all that it would take to be a star. But on the other hand, he did tour much more outside the area than Bouzou. Bouzou was much older, of course, so of course he was much more frail and not as able to do that. I think that someone like Bouzou, and I may be wrong, this may be romanticizing a bit, but my sense is that it's possible that he had a little bit more humor about the competitiveness of the Zydeco Wars, and that Bojack, in fact, was so completely personally identified with it that it's sort of like win, lose, or die,
Well, battling was part of his shtick.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what
and Bouzou would do that too,
Yeah,
but my
yeah.
sense was that he would do it with much, as I say, much more of a sense of humor or tongue-in-cheek about it. That, if Bojack might have won a particular round, it wasn't that big a deal. He just, that there was something far less, in my opinion, macho about, and that, in fact, Bo was a very macho guy.
In what way was he wanting in terms of what he would do to help promote his music or promote his own art?
He was not as aware as people who are really media savvy, including a 14-year-old like what's her name, Britney Spears would be, at how much time you have to spend sort of, if not cultivating journalists, at least being polite and working hard to make as many interviews as possible and things like that. There are some artists who are very good at that, in which case it can definitely help their bread and butter situation. And Bouzou was not Bouzou, but Bojack was one of those people who, there would be some periods of time that he'd be a little bit better about if the promotion department had set up interviews at doing them, and other times he would either just blow them off or say, I'm not available.
Now, you would try to do that. You say your promotion from yourself, right? Or would set those things up?
In many cases, sometimes promoters would. But anyone basically who had a stake in trying to make a show a success would, that's, one of the main ways you can do it. And of course, there's the oddity factor when we have artists who are very odd compared to a lot of people who are coming through Boston or New York or whatever, then hopefully you can find some people who want to do a piece on this artist, and frequently that would be the case. Now it is much more competitive than it was even, I would say, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. But even so, it's still an important part of what it takes to sell a show and to sell some records for us in the bigger cities in particular.
I'm going to try to talk to Brad when he's here on Thursday. I have a feeling it's not going to amount to much time. Maybe you can. It seems that you've got a lot of artists to keep track of and going around. How do you sort of pick and choose who you're going to actually get personally as a label involved?
Well, a lot of it depends on, of course, who has the most recent releases. But it also it may involve, for example, who we have longer-term contracts with, and of course people who are playing venues or contexts that are promotable. So, for example, we do have a lot of artists who play festivals, but they may not be festivals that are in an area where there are even record stores, in which case there's not a whole lot that we can do aside from mail order kinds of things and direct consumer kinds of things, or to do that much. So that's a lot of what what are the most recent releases, and B, long-term artist development with artists who have a relationship with a booking agent who's going to be able to develop their career, their touring career.
And Brad, I take it whoever works with you, they're going to keep tabs on this?
Yeah,
That's where
and
that
they,
lies.
I mean, in fact, I'm sure at some point you may want to just sit in on one of Brad's promotion and publicity meetings.
I did that last.
Oh, you did that last
spring.
time.
I did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was quick, but I had to realize that it was part of an ongoing process. They were
Mhm.
talking about things that they talked about
Yeah.
last meeting, so
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
something that we're on. But yeah, although it was interesting in the sense that it actually that touring troubadours little compilation that you put out for
Mhm.
artists to sell. It was discussed at that meeting, and then it was out. It's like a month later.
Yeah.
Because it was just taking things off of other records and getting them pressed,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
that was a kind of funny thing to see. But
Yeah. You saw it from start to finish,
so
conception to realization. Yeah.
I wonder if it did any good.
Well, actually, I think that it's continued. I mean, we are doing the Traveling Troubadours compilations. In fact, I just noticed an email from, you might want to talk to Jeff about that, Jeff Walker, because in fact I know he's been selling some of them to clubs now. Passing it was an email just in the last week or so about Passing saying that they were doing really well with the most recent one.
Right, let me use the restroom. Okay. How are you? Now, if you don't mind, I said I wanted to talk a little bit about some more about background. We did some of this, and you said that you thought the political records might be best talked about in the context of your own motivations and interests. And that's where I kind of had in mind wanting to go to.
Especially since you know Archie Green.
Yeah, well, yeah, Archie was. Archie wants me, and I don't think I'm going to do this. I'll tell you because it was almost. Archie wants me to see the papers you wrote in college, and I said I don't know that they could put their hands on them that readily, Archie. I don't know, but.
Yeah, you probably. But you know what? It's interesting because for me, and if you ever, when you talk to Archie again, please feel free to not only say hi but tell him about this. But I've in fact. Like in the springtime, this past springtime, I just took a course at Radcliffe Seminars in which I in fact went back to a figure who interested me, an historical figure, late 19th century Russian-born woman, who I really was influenced by a lot when I was in college as an undergraduate. And so it was interesting to go back to her 30 years later and still be influenced by her, but in very different ways. So, in fact, I'm very much coming from where Archie's coming from in terms of a sense of history and a sense of what influenced me and what you take from it at different points in your life, including the music that we record. But it's been very, very interesting. There was a book I almost... a course I almost took this fall with a lady who's in her 90s now. Unfortunately, may not be teaching that much longer, but who wrote a memoir called Great Day Coming that was about 30s communists. Hope Hale Davis is her name.
That name has been used. Serge Denisov, sociologist, wrote a book called that. That's interesting about communists.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Great Day Coming is much more of a personal memoir, and she was married to. She and her husband were both in a communist cell, and they lived outside Washington, D.C. And just a wonderful story, but more from the point of view of kind of the cultural and social milieu, as opposed to just the pure political. See, that's where Archie's kind of different from me or us. Is he is much more into the narrow political and labor oriented kind of world than we ever were. But on the other hand, there's a lot, politically that was in that time that I think is still very deeply a part of Ken, Bill, and me.
We talked last time about your growing up to a small degree. Talked about the physical locale and what your family did for a living, your brothers and sisters. But you spoke also of reading a great deal because you knew it was going to get you the hell out of there. That's what I stuck in my mind. You knew that if you read and studied, you could.
But it's also because it was an alternative reality too.
Right. What do you think was an early shaper of any type of political or public consciousness? I don't want to use political in a narrow sense, but political in a broad sense, a public consciousness, the consciousness of the connection to other people in the world, part of consciousness that you're...
Well, it's not all that atypical, but certainly the church. And even today, even though I am a convert to Judaism, the temple is still very important to me, and the church definitely was when I was growing up.
You're Baptist?
Yeah. And the music that we sang in the Baptist church, and it was interesting, I heard somebody playing, playing a hymn that we used to sing, and it was just very, very moving. Even now, some of those tunes and melodies, and if you ask Ken about it, Ken remembers me singing hymns when we were driving along in the car. Now, I know that this was not when Bill was there, but this would have been just Ken and me. So that was certainly an early shaper, and it's kind of like AJ in a way, like my son. I was a leader in the church. I was like president of the Baptist Youth Fellowship and vice president of the County Youth Group Association and president of the Girls Guild and the only teenage member of the Wednesday night Bible study. But I really loved reading the Bible. And to this day, one of my great joys would be to learn ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew so that I could just go back and read some of those texts in the original, which is the reason I'm also thinking of maybe a doctorate in theology. But so that was a part of it, and that was my social world. When you grow up in a town of under 1,000 people, that's basically sort of so far from the mainstream that it's like living in the 19th century, then the church and your school and your family are your world. And I think a lot has to do with my position in the family. I was the oldest kid, and my mother was definitely more a dominant figure in my family than my father was, who was very sweet, but not as strong a person as she, or as strong a personality as she is. And then I had a brother. It's like there were two separate sets of kids, and the brother who was a year and a half younger than me was like my mother's little golden boy, and I was the apple of my father's eye, so there's the classic kind of rivalry. Not classic sibling rivalry, but it's more like wanting to be recognized and have that sort of same kind of easygoing acceptance that my brother had for doing nothing. But I would be like working really hard to get straight A's, and my mother would say, well, that's nice, dear. But it was no big deal. So I was, I think, always more motivated than, that was also something that made me a lot more motivated than a lot of the kids I grew up with. That particular thing of just being in that place in the family, too. And then by the time that I went away to college, I mean, I remember in terms of the shaping of my own social and political consciousness, both Bill and I grew up as very cerebral and intellectualized political types when we were young, when we were going back to high school. And both of us were conservatives, political conservatives, who flip-flopped in college around the time of the Vietnam War.
Okay, you were in high school in the early 60s. Was the 4 years in high school? 62,
Yeah.
66.
Yeah.
Okay.
But both Bill and I had very
Goldwater
early
supporter?
I was a Goldwater supporter. In fact, I was one of only 2 people in my high school who voted for Goldwater.
election.
And in our little high school election, but we did have a debate, and I was also a champion debater, as you could, was kind of a logical extension of things that I did in the church too.
Were your
I felt
parents Gold Web supporters?
No, but I always like to give my parents a lot of grief about everything, so of course not. I'm not sure that they had all that strong an opinion on Goldwater versus Johnson, in fact, at that time, but I certainly did, and I won the debate, even though the whole school voted for Johnson. I debated our most charismatic, and he was older than I was, debater in the high school, but I won the debate.
Now, what were the values that you were supporting there, if you do? I realize
the Christian anti-communist crusade.
Okay,
and in fact, I remember I remember exactly the most important book I read during that time was John Stormer's None Dare Call It Treason. Treason doth not prosper. What's the reason for if it prosper, none dare call it treason? And basically saying that our government has been involved in this strategy, which of course no liberal would ever believe is true, of basically supporting communists throughout the world. And the Christian anti-communist crusade, which really was, I learned many, many years afterwards, of course, was around the same time as, the anti-Castro groups in this country being founded. But it was very good and very effective propaganda for someone who really had very little contact with the outside world. And I got their newsletter regularly every month or 6 weeks. I was a subscriber and believed that was the best way to, spread the missionary word around the world about democracy and Christianity. But the tarnishing began when I was a freshman in high school. And my favorite high school teacher, who was both my French teacher and she was also my English teacher, and a couple of other things, because it was a 3-room schoolhouse with 3 teachers is where I went to high school. And I was the last year before our town went to a regional high school. But I was the last year of graduating from Terryfield Academy, which was founded in 1826. And I had a very good civics teacher and this woman who was my favorite teacher, and I forget which of them, whether it was Mr. Garnett or whether it was this other woman teacher, brought in the New York Times that had the story about the civil rights workers being murdered. And of course, the line, if you believe Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, or if you read None Dare Call It Treason, I think it was most strongly in Conscience of a Conservative, is that anybody who wants to make a success and to get an education is capable of doing so. And it is not racism or sexism or any of those kinds of things that would hold people down, although that was before anybody ever used the term sexism all that much. But when I first read the front page of the New York Times about the civil rights workers in the South, then I realized for the first time I had an inkling of how completely out of it I was, and how there was a whole world out there of people oppressed in far worse ways than I was. And because I was from a very poor family, and I felt, well, if I can get an education, and I'm from the kind of family I'm from, in terms of poor, and in our family, books were number one. We were one of those old-fashioned, one of those values that, well, we may be poor, but we're proud kind of thing. And it worked for us, in the kind of world we lived in. But I could see that there might be other people for whom they would simply feel beaten down in coming from exactly the same kind of background. And the South and the Civil Rights Movement was what first made me aware of that, and it was literally only reading about it in the New York Times. Mind you, I'd never seen a black person, I never saw a Jewish person, I never saw a Catholic person when I was growing up.
Are we still talking about high school?
Yeah.
Or when you
in
went?
high school.
Did you go to Wesleyan? Is that where you went?
No,
You went to Clark?
Jake Gurelnick went to Wesleyan, I went to Clark.
You went to Clark, okay.
But I started out at Northeastern here in Boston, which is where I got my master's degree.
Okay.
And Northeastern, so I came to Boston right from this tiny
so
little town
Northeastern
in
to
Maine.
Clark, and then back to
Yep.
school. Okay,
And with lots of traveling with Ken and Bill to the South. in between times
But
when we were going to fiddlers conventions and so on.
You're digressing there. You were back in
Yes.
high school reading about the civil
Yep.
rights movement. Okay.
Yeah, and so really reading about the civil rights movement was the first inkling I had. But then the other thing that is I realized that I loved literature too much to be a good Christian, at least a good Baptist. And so by the time I was finished with high school, I was already, heading down that road toward agnosticism because I was, for example, I loved reading Shakespeare in high school and just interpreting it and reading about the world that Shakespearean plays came from, Shakespearean dramas, and being looked at kind of like this by my minister and his wife, who were my best friends. I used to babysit for their kids, and the minister's wife gave me piano lessons, and I was, of course, a star in the church and all of that. But when they started raising their eyebrows about the books I was reading, then it was like, whoa, wait a minute here. If I can't be a Christian and have this, I'm afraid I can't be a Christian. Because this is how, to me there was something that was equally deep to the Bible. And I wasn't going to be limited to it. And so then I went away to Northeastern. That was indeed a baptism by fire, being in the city, not the university, but just being in the city at the time that the anti-war movement was just really getting going. And there were love-ins on the Boston Common, and there was great folk music it was called Passim by then. No, it was still the Club 47 at that point, yeah. And so all of that was just, as I say, a baptism by fire. I'd been baptized before, but this was my new baptism. And so even though I was, as early as when I was a freshman in college, I was still a leader in the Young Republicans at the university. But I remember going to a mock presidential convention at MIT that year. And I was still in the Young Republican Club, but I'd already worked my way over to being to the liberal part of the Young Republicans. I was supportive of the few Republicans at that point in time who were starting to question the Vietnam War. So I was rapidly, and this was back at a time, of course, that Reagan was still a shining light to true conservative Republicans. This is 10 years and more before he was close to being president. And there were the hardcore, the diehard people who had been in Young Americans for Freedom and the John Birch Society, like Bill had, who thought that Reagan was just this brilliant conservative who would be, the great savior of the country in terms of political conservatism. So, and then by the time I was a sophomore, I was finished with the Young Republicans. I'd already worked my way all the way to being in SDS by the time I was a junior.
Well, you did that too quickly for me.
Well, there was so much anti-war activity on college campuses, and there was so much more intellectually that was stimulating and made sense and was welcoming of new ideas and stuff, whereas it was sort of like being a Baptist all over again. If you were going to be a Young Republican, it's like, follow the goddamn party line or you're out of here.
But you made a leap with SDS to not simply anti-war activism, but to a different economic worldview in a sense. And I don't know. Again, it might be unfair to say that an 18-year-old was fully aware of all of that, but
right,
it might have been.
Right, but don't forget that intellectually, if you come from a place of like the Christian anti-communist crusade, which is already extremely critical of the established governmental order, I think in a way it's an easier flip-flop to go from there to SDS in a way than it is to go from the Young Republicans to there. It's like the Young Republicans were more like a stopping point along, they were just like a little watering point along the way.
SDS was a church with 3
Yes.
Right.
And it was a matter of extremes. And in fact, Bill and I were the political extremists of the three of us. Ken was more experientially involved in radical politics.
Going to demonstrations or things of that nature.
Yeah, that was what more radicalized Ken, I think, than sitting around and reading books about it. Whereas with Bill and me, we both are the kind of people who sit around and read lots of books about stuff. And the women's movement definitely was around about the same time as SDS. So in fact, I was involved when Ken was still an undergraduate at Cornell. I mean, I was an undergraduate and Ken was in graduate school at Cornell, and I was involved in some of the first consciousness raising groups and talking to people in the freshman dorms at Cornell when we would have discussion groups about international politics, in particular the Vietnam War and the communist threat, and about sexism and racism and stuff. So
you were registered at Cornell?
No, I wasn't registered at Cornell. I, in fact, took off part of a semester at Clark to live in Ithaca, in the commune that Ken was living in. As it turned out, I really didn't wind up losing the whole semester. I just wound up sort of taking my exams and writing a lot of papers, because I was taking a number of independent study courses anyway. So I didn't really lose any time. Still graduated with my class, but I was living in Ithaca as much as I was living in Worcester. And I also saw Little Richard for the first time during that time, which was equally a radicalizing influence to me.
How so?
Oh, God, he was just incredible. He was, again, it's what we were talking about before in terms of the force of personality and being able to understand someone, to feel that you really and truly have understood them and known them completely, because their persona is so, not just flamboyant, but it's like just letting it all hang out. And Little Richard at that point was like that. This was before his many conversions. He still was not, he was not out by any means.
I was going to ask if he was feminized at all.
Well, you know, he always was feminized, but since nobody talked that much about gay culture, and this was before the first biographies of Little Richard had been published, and before he'd gone through his many conversions and talked about how, you know, wicked he was because he was bisexual, if not homosexual. He was, I can still remember what he was wearing, and he was playing a white piano, and he was wearing these red bell-bottom silk pants with this red loose top that had little diamond-shaped mirrors all over it. And then after he completely sweated the whole thing through and just playing one set, he then got up on top of the piano and he took off his shirt and he twirled it around in the air like this, and then he threw it into the crowd. And this was not a big place. This was like a big barn where he was playing. So it was not, this was Little Richard when he was not quite in the dregs of his career, but he was just starting to come back. It was around the same...
68 to 70?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And he still was in great shape, and he still had his trademark good looks, his bouffant, I don't know whether it was a wig or a hairdo, and his little pencil thin mustache, and he definitely wore, he wore lipstick and he wore his makeup, and he looked great.
Yeah, I'm trying to fix my mind around that. I'm not sure if the older generation of rock and rollers had become hip by then. There was a time, because that was flower power and the hippies, and I think a lot of that generation was discounted. It's just oldie stuff that I can't remember. Yeah,
Little Richard got a little bit of a boost from the kind of the rock and roll coming of age, beginnings of rock and roll at that time. but he was still sort of an oddity on the fringes of it. And I think, in fact, Ken and I may have we were writing reviews of shows for a couple of different papers, and we may have written one for the Radical Rag that came out of our commune about Little Richard. And I remember Ken getting very pissed off and impatient because nobody else recognized the political significance of Little Richard the way we did, and which I definitely did. But I didn't give a damn whether they cared or not.
Significance of Little Richard?
Oh my God! It was just like, talk about true personal liberation, just in terms of flying in the face of everything that, you know, establishment culture looks like, talks like, walks like. Here's Little Richard, and to me it was like the freeing of your soul, you know, and that's the way I think of music and politics and the things that I really love. Is there is a transcendent moment to it all, and Little Richard, man oh man, at that point he personified the transcendent moment in all its glory.
So you were writing these cultural reviews, reading political work and literature, going to anti-war demonstrations.
We wrote reviews of demonstrations too.
You reviewed demonstrations.
That was what a unique moment in time, a moment in history that was.
Demonstration is performance.
That's right.
One could be very cynical about that if one is conservative, of course, or opposed to the purposes of the demonstration. Listening to folk music, I don't know how much you were going to. Were you caught up in the music scene in Boston?
Yep, and in fact, at that point in Ithaca, we were the Ithaca Area Friends of Bluegrass and Old Time Country Music. And this was before we moved here with Bill at the first department on Somerville Avenue, and got involved with the Boston Area Friends of Bluegrass and Old Time Country Music, which I think we were involved in the founding of. But we were the Ithaca Area Friends of Bluegrass and Old Time Country Music. I can't remember, there may have been a little bit of university money to fund these concerts, but the concerts, in order to break even, definitely depended upon being well promoted. So we had to do all that we could to sort of turn our apartment, this was after the commune, into the concert line center.